Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tiana Uchas, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar on Pamela Smith's Making and Knowing project, a research cluster with the Center for Science and Society. It is my distinct pleasure this afternoon to chair the session Weaving Code, the original mobile app. Our speaker this afternoon is Carol Cassidy, the founder of Lao Textiles, a studio and gallery in Vientiane, Laos, employing around 40 skilled artisans. Carol has devoted her career to the preservation and economic development of local weaving traditions of artisans from across the world. She will speak for around 30 minutes, leaving ample time for questions, and then those of you who have signed up for this afternoon's weaving demonstrations will meet back at the registration table and be led over to Fairweather 13 to meet 3 team members from Lao Textiles: Master Weaver Miss Bua, ECOT Master Weaver Miss Simone, and Senior Administrator Miss Pon. And Carol, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Columbia University, for bringing weaving into the sphere of math, science, and art. So I am a weaver, and I know some of you here who are also. And weaving means many things to many different people. It depends on your personal experience with it. And so I'm going to try to present for you some of what my experience has been. What you're looking at here is a vertical heddle. And what that is one of these strings represents one row of a computer program. So this was the mother of the jacquard and the barcode for how weaving was mechanized. So what I want you to do is just kind of look at that for a minute, and then I'm going to take you on my journey. And what we heard about this morning about the brain was about a process. For me, weaving is a process. It started when I was very young. I keep learning. I keep exploring the magic of different kinds of weaving. We had Carla Childs, who is here, and she'll be with me over at the Fairweather demonstrating her weaving as well. So, like I said, it means a lot of things to different people. But I originally arrived in Laos from Mozambique, where I had been working for 8 years in southern Africa, working with women to try to provide an income by using their traditional skills. That included spinning, mohair, basketry, and other kinds of crafts. So, just for those of you who might not have been in Southeast Asia, Laos is a landlocked country. And part of what, how I came up with the title is that if you look up on the north, I don't have that pointer, but if you look up where it says Tai Dang, up, and then there's something called Tai Dam and Tai Khao. These are different ethnic groups that come from the north of Laos. This was the part of Laos that was the most heavily bombed by the United States during the Secret War. So as part of the war process, the Americans had to offload their sorties, and they offloaded them in Laos, not in Vietnam, which was at the top of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that meant that the sorties were dropped in Laos, which was the heart of Lao weaving. So that meant that if you get a chance to come over, 2 of our master weavers are from that part of Laos, and their grandmothers had to flee that area. And all they could bring with them was their skill and their knowledge in the insides of their loom. So it became mobile, in a sense, in response to a historic event, which was a US air bombing. And they brought those skills with them when they then came to Vientiane. So that was kind of the place that I arrived in 1989 to see and to understand and to learn that these historic textiles, which belong to the many, many ethnic groups in Laos, had particular use, function, technique, design, fiber, depending on the ethnic group, what they wanted to say, and how they said it. Weaving was embedded in the religion. Here you have a mural from one of the temples in Luang Prabang, where you have one weaver who's kind of looking for a husband and the other weaver that's diligently weaving away, which is how in folklore you would find a good husband. But weaving is carried out in many ways. The way they created a warp, depended on where they were from. The kinds of textiles they made depended on what the weather was. This is a silk ground with a hand-spun cotton indigo weft. In the north of Laos, it's quite chilly, so you would make textiles out of both. Here you have another type of weaving, say it's the similar type of vertical heddle, but you see the young girl sitting there. This knowledge was passed down, not in a university and not in a school, but at home from one generation of women to the next. So this is actually how these complex notions, and Bua, who is here with us, learned when she was 7 years old. By the time she was 12, she was a master. So the kinds of textiles that we created with some of these, and I'll go into the technical side in a minute, but these are amazing, the result of complex techniques. A piece like the skirt on your left includes tapestry, continuous supplementary, discontinuous supplementary, weft ECOT. So kind of combinations thereof. So the weaver who was trying to create something beautiful that represented her heritage would embellish in ways in which she could, using the techniques that she could master. Here you have other examples of this. So you have a rich history of storytelling and belief systems. This is an animist piece, and we have some samples over in the other room, where people, the weavers were either weaving from a historic textile or creating their own story and narrative and what they believed. This particular one is called Climbing Monkey. When I arrived in Laos, textiles, it was a closed communist country. And it was only because I sort of had a socialist pedigree, having studied in Scandinavia, working in Mozambique, and married to an Ethiopian, that they allowed an American to enter the field of weaving there. So this was the poster for the Lao Women's Union, whom I worked for, which the Lao Women's Union was the political arm of the Pathet Lao, who were the winners of the American War. And we were working with what they said were improved technologies. But during that time, I had the opportunity to explore the ancient textiles, traditions, and craft, and thought it was rather silly that I was called a weaving expert when I was dealing with women who had much more knowledge than I did. So I started by, when we started Lao Textiles, replicating historic textiles. And the way in which we had to do that included many features. We had to secure a supply of silk, and we had to work with mulberry farmers on a large scale, villagers to collect them, and all the aspects that are involved in producing or replicating a historic textile. The silk we use in Laos is a local variety. It's not the glossy silk that you think of because it's not a hybrid. It's an indigenous variety. And so the traditional skills you see in each of these, children play an important part of being with their elder and learning that from the elder. This was a training course that we did with some of the different ethnic groups. And then when the silk would then come from the districts, it was brought to Vientiane, to our studio. At the studio, and it was, there was a difference in the kind of textiles and design that you would see in tribal textiles and that you would see in urban textiles. Our house and office has an important history. It was the governor of French colonial Indochina's son who married the daughter of the local administrator in Vientiane. It was designed by Prince Sivanapuma, and it was his first architectural project when he returned from Paris as an engineer. So we occupy a place that has a history of making, and traditional families in Laos, especially if they were urban and of a certain status, they had their textiles made for them. They would have an event, a wedding, a funeral, a marriage, and they would think about what they wanted made. So we actually have our studio in that very same space. Color is an important feature, and we worked initially with hundreds of farmers to have them raise the silk and then actually weave very simple items that they could have improved and increased income even though it was in a rural area. I did not put our label on that because I felt we needed to give, to recognize that this was from silk farmers, so it was labeled as such. So we have, when we started, we had the same team of weavers. We had 5, which I trained. We built looms. We used very simple technology, which I love this picture because you can just see how simple and basic it is. And then those weavers have stayed with us, and we have the same group of weavers for 27 and a half years. Here, just dressing the loom, I won't go into it too much, we can see it, but people are very concerned with time. And everyone asks, how long did it take? And it could take anywhere from, this has probably 2,000 ends. That has to be dyed, that has to be extracted. The silkworm has to be cleaned and dyed and twisted and starched and plied, and then the warp is prepared and we tie it on 1 knot at a time. So that could take a week or 2 or more. And then depending on the weaving technique, we actually make our comb, which we make out of 1 continuous piece of bamboo. So all of these are additional crafts that we need to create our tools for weaving that actually affect the complex construction of the fabric. So here you see, this is the Lao loom, where you have, you see the warp, and then you see a secondary vertical heddle set where you have, let's see, above the warp and below the warp.
You might point out what the warp is and
Oh.
what the comb is and what the vertical heddle is frontally.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try to bring this over here.
Okay.
So a warp. Those are the vertical, the horizontal threads here that are that we create how many we want, how tight or close or far apart they are, and then this is the comb, which determines the density. And then we have this, what I call the ground heddle set. It's a plain weave. It's 1 end through each of the eyes of the heddle.
And it makes both halves of the warp, I mean, it makes the 2 pieces of the warp go up and down.
Yeah, it separates into up or down. Then we have a secondary heddle system, and this is what we call a long-eyed vertical heddle. And this has either 1 or 2 ends through each of these heddles, and we are able to create a program. And that program is based on a binary system where we show 1 string for 1 row of pattern. This is what I mean by program. We sit at a loom, we use a tool, it's usually a piece of bamboo, something like that, and we imagine the design we're going to make, and we use the tool to create the binary code for that particular row of design. So here, this is Bua, and she's counting how many threads are going to be up and how many threads are going to be down, and that is, she's actually now the master programmer. So she's going to determine what this row is going to look like. But unlike in other places in the world, the Lao loom enables us to store the design. So we have the hardware here of this secondary long-eyed vertical heddle where there is pattern rods. These are called pattern rods over here. And each 1 row of those pattern rods represents 1 row of design. So this is why I call my title the original mobile app, because this is a very mobile system. This is our floppy drive, and so our software where we can create a pattern, we can store it, we can take it with us, and we can recreate it later for whatever particular use we might want to. So here, now, in order to recreate the shed, which is the separation of the threads, raised or lowered, up or down, 1 or 0, we use a sword to create that space where we then insert our weft. So here you can see these are the rows of design where the master programmer, weaver, created the row of pattern with a sequence of up and down, and then to save or store that row of design, we then inserted one row of string. Now, on some of the textiles that we do hundreds and hundreds of design rods. Here we have one with about 200. So people ask me during this conference, how many heddles are you working with? With this very simple technology, we are able to weave highly complex fabrics that are only limited by the imagination of the weaver and the height of that vertical heddle. Now, just a note, this traditionally this was used, they would use a piece of bamboo and not a piece of like this is a fishing line or a nylon string. The nylon string, because it's thinner, allowed us to weave more complex patterns. So here you can see and you'll note there's a number, the number on here, 23. That refers to a Laotian system of units of counting, which they're called LOPE, and it refers to 40 ends. And so this would be 23 times 40, usually 2 ends. So it would actually be 23 times 80 would be the number of threads that would be there. So this is a unique and complex mathematics that young weavers in Laos, depending on their ethnic group, learn from their mother. Here you can see some of the notations. That 28 would refer to the number of lope, 95 refers to the width. So, and then here you see the most of our tools, most everything would be used from local raw materials. The men would actually generally build the loom, the hardware, and the women would do the programming or the software. We practice different techniques, and one of them is ECOT, and we have quite a nice display over at the demonstration hall. But you can see what it is. It's a resist-dye method where we predetermine the design in advance. We tie off the part of the design we want to remain a certain color. We dye the balance a certain color. It is all one continuous thread, so we have to keep it in order. We wind it on bobbins, and then you can see that thread kept, they have to be spooled in order so that when you start to weave, you have the pattern emerge from one continuous thread. Here, the way that I started to work was working with historic fabrics because I thought that gave me the basis, and I think it's important that learning process. So what I did was I researched and then analyzed and then started to recreate the historic fabrics. And then once we mastered those techniques, and I think it was Roger and Izzy, they talked about mastering techniques. You know, it's a lifetime of learning, which is why my experience is this journey of weaving. I continue to work all over the world with weavers, and I am never cease to be amazed by the unique versions that weavers. I was just in Northeast India at the Loin Loom Festival, where the various groups of the Naga weavers have various methods for creating supplementary pattern. Well, I didn't know that, and I watched them weave, and it's just amazing to me. So here, by looking at historic fabrics, we were then able to analyze and create contemporary pieces. So these are some of the contemporary designs that were based on skill sets that were ancient skill sets, and then I made, and our staff made, creative decisions based on experience, the thickness of the silk, the kind of silk. On this one, for example, I introduced this rib with fringe, which was a nice, neat way of being able to adjust your ECOT and have a beautiful salvage. So these are creative interpretations. You know, discontinuous ECOT, where we do contemporary installations. The densities, this is a transparent fabric that it's actually a warp and a weft ECOT. But Laos and the weaving skills in Laos enabled myself as a textile designer and weaver to work with these techniques once we had mastered the replica to do contemporary creative work. So I studied in Scandinavia. I studied with Damask master Dory Young, learned my basic skills in rural Norway. And you can see this is, I studied in the 1970s, so this probably looks a little bit like the 1970s, which I'm practicing ECOT. Simone, who's here, she's our master. She started with us when she was 17 or 18 years old, and we have an entire generation of weavers who have continued to be gainfully employed and creating wonderful contemporary iterations where we mix supplementary, ECOT, very modern. We also do tapestry weave. This is our master weaver. Mostly women weave in Laos, but there are exceptions to every rule. And Mr. Ott, who is a master weaver, retired after 25 years, but decided he couldn't stay away, so he's come back as a creative designer. And we weave tapestry. This would be just to show you some of the complex, and we combine all of those different techniques. I know there are some weavers here, and I don't want to lose you all, but this is, I worked with warp-weighted looms when I worked and studied in Norway, put myself through weaving school. And this is a local Laotian version of a supplementary warp where we use rocks to weight the loom. And what we have there is, you see where those bands are? That is supplementary warp, and we're using local, just rocks to weight it. And it looks like this from the weaver's perspective. And then those bands can be constructed in any width or complexity, thickness. And if you're really lucky, we can do your sofa. This is from an architectural project we did in Paris. It was one of our first projects after we did a show in New York. And it's for a designer, and he said, our fabrics weren't wide enough. Everyone said, oh, your fabrics just aren't wide enough. And it took this particular designer to say, I'll design my sofa around your fabric, and not the other way around. So here you can see another iteration of that. So this is, the creative process where, traditional weavers and their work are used in a contemporary context. These are more brocades. So it could be that we do for a chair. You might recognize this house. It's a New York apartment where we did the ECOT here. We did the curtains, decoration that was woven. Here's a sofa, another sofa. This is the same ECOT that we have on display over in the other hall. So how they can be used is very different. And we combine techniques, as I said. Here you see this is an ECOT that we use supplementary. People, I think today, it's really important that the amount of time that you spend to weave something and to dig deep into knowledge. And textile design can mean many things. For me, it's the understanding of the materials, the threads, because we twist our silk, we dye our silk, we clean our silk, we're handling it, like Izzy mentioned. And she had a very important point. She said, even after 40 years, you're never an expert. And I've been weaving for about 42 years, and I'm far from an expert. So that was a very important comment. So here, for example, I'm experimenting with transparent, because in Finland, I did a lot of transparent weave. But in Southeast Asia, we don't really do transparent. So I'm experimenting with some supplementary design, but on a transparent background. So this is all just sort of, there you can see another one. ECOT with supplementary. There is no end to design and creativity, and you sit at a loom, and this is a project we did for an important retailer in France, where they wanted many, many kinds and colors of heavy textured silk. I personally dyed all of those, probably why I have a problem with my L4, L5. A lot of bending over, but you can see here. So, and then it's kind of the backstory, and it's what we talked about, the glamour of fashion or luxury. There's a backstory, and these ended up at the home or the building of a luxury retailer, but there was a lot of hard work involved in getting it to come out right. Measurement is something that's very local. Some women know how to measure in their own language or by a foot or a finger. And so in order to do complex projects where we have to do paneling, that's been one of the most complex aspects to our work. This is in our studio upstairs where we'll have projects where we might have 30 panels that will take us 3 years to weave, and then they all have to match. So it's, you can just see how much she loves that pillow. So one of the things that I love about what I do is we do different kinds of fabrics in different cultures. And this is a Bedouin design, and I work with a weaver in Kuwait and with weavers in Kuwait. We do all kinds of different fabrics and designs, and it's interesting for us because it's really out of our comfort zone, and we have to figure out that, in the Bedouin world, you have certain angles, and those angles have to be right. So you can't just put in one end of weft. You have to put in 2 or 3, and they have to be in a certain way. And so it's been a learning exercise for us. We also work in Japan. We do obi, we do kimono. So I take on challenges just because I think it's so fun to do. And now, after 27, 28 years, our weavers also think of it as fun. Here we make all our fringe, twist every piece, so it's very hands-on. Every aspect of it is part of the whole. So the fringe, how we twist it, the way it ends, the finishing, are all part of the final presentation. This is our studio where we work. It's just beautiful. The architecture, it's all original wood. I just feel so privileged to have been able to be part of that. I often use architectural work as part of features in our work. Endless design, as I said. The ability to use the program enables us to recall parts of the program, all of the program, and insert into the program part of the creative process. So there is just no limit to how we use that program. And because we've actually created it, we can interrupt it, we can mirror it at any time, we can take elements of that. So architecture and the Buddhist culture, which is very much a part of Laos, is often represented in some of our work. Here you have, this is the naga, which is an important feature, also represented in traditional textiles. You can see here. Combining, there you see the naga, right here again. Nagas are usually, they appear, it's a mythological protector of the spirit, and it's always usually found at a temple, but we happen to have it on our office because it was designed by Prince Suvarnabhuma, who was a royal. So you can just see playing with techniques, designs. Here you have an interlocking naga. The interlocking naga was considered one of the most powerful because it was 2 nagas that were intersecting. We have had all the same weavers, so as we've had to transition over these years, a 30-year-old weaver is now a 60-year-old weaver. And that has been, we have had to find jobs and redefine jobs as they were no longer able to weave these complex pieces where they can then just wind a bobbin and they can still be employed and still have income. This is Bua, who is our 2nd generation, and she's here. She's if you get a chance to come, and if you haven't seen her weaving, it's mental gymnastics and choreography combined, and she's an extraordinary weaver. Here's Simone, who's here with us, and that's her young daughter. As part of it is transmission of knowledge. And what I found is I'm working now in Myanmar, in Burma, and it's a very different story because they have schools. There's a weaving school. And what we found in our studies are that the weavers that went to the schools are not nearly as good as the weavers that learned from their mother. I occasionally get to weave, just not very often, but when we're doing a new design or a new thing. And this is my daughter. And we did a fashion show in Shanghai in, I don't know, she was 9 years old. You can't just wear textiles, you have to learn how to make them. And so here's our family in Laos, where we all, and my husband, who is very much a part of this and the only reason we actually make a living. And well, he does all the, like, the billing and all. He's like, did you send them that order? I'm like, let me think. So part of it is that combination. He's from Ethiopia, which has a rich and long history of weaving, which now we're revisiting. It's really a family, and we have been a family. It is the Lao Textile family. We are on our second generation. It's been full-time gainful employment for almost 30 years. Part of what we like to do and is happening throughout Asia is that young people are forgetting their traditions, and we like to bring the schools in and the students in. It's the reason I was so excited to come here for this conference with Pamela's work and what she's doing, and the importance of preserving and maintaining these skills and passing them to the next generation. I just put this one in because I wanted to emphasize that very often people tell you that you're not a vital part of the economy. All of our weavers have bought land and built houses. They have all been able to improve their lives by using their traditional skills. This is an exceptional house. It looks like the White House. And Chan, again, one of our original early weavers. We have the same team. And this is Pon, who you have here with us, our administrator and our master weaver. And the reason she didn't come with us was she was maintaining, building this new house. So they are very much a part of the global economy in what I think of as a very positive way. This is our second demonstration here in New York, the first time at Columbia, which is extraordinary. This particular show was at the Fashion Institute, which is much more the conventional way in which people think of textiles in an art institution. We did demonstrate and teach for several months. We taught at Pratt Visual FIT. Maybe some of you remember that. And then we've done exhibitions. In the Southwest, I work with various weavers around the world. This was in San Francisco at the Craft and Folk Art. And it's also part of the learning process where the diaspora are able to see that these traditions continue. So there's a lot of components to it that are very valuable. One of the things that Pamela's been saying is that, the fact that you here at Columbia value this has a loop of feedback and acknowledgement where I'm teaching and working in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. I'm off to Taiwan tomorrow night, where the fact that it has value here makes people think, does it have value there? And I think that this is really, we're at a critical juncture with some of our artisans. This was in the Southwest, where we had the monks come and do all the ceremonies, which are traditional. And most of my work is within ASEAN. And ASEAN is an economic unit in Southeast Asia. And there you can see we're all represented. From Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, and Vietnam is one of our close allies, and I've been conducting training with CraftLink and some of the other artisan groups. I want to just, we weave all kinds of things. We weave all sizes. This is an elephant weaving competition. It took 3 weavers 3 months, and the winner of the beauty contest gets to wear our silk. And how important your hands are. For us, I work every single day with my hands, how it's done, how carefully it's done. We have some of our work at the other building. You can see our salvages. You can see the back side. You can see the front side. Some people can't tell the difference. This is the end. These are my daughter's hands, and I feel it's so important that we pass down knowledge to the next generation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. One of the things that interests me very much about this idea of the weaving program is the ways in which weavers might depart from the program. You mentioned a little bit about creativity, and I'm personally interested in improvisation. And I wonder in what ways and to what extent weavers are improvising as they weave. If you might say a bit about that. Thanks very much.
Yeah. That's an important part of the learning process. And as I said, we spent the first 10 years replicating historic fabrics and textiles, but once we mastered our tools and we had a really deep understanding of what weaving could be, we were then able to move into those creative processes. And when we're in the unknown world, we're not now replicating historic textiles, so we have no guideline. That is when some of our most creative contemporary work happens, because we're not following a formula, we're not, we haven't seen or been influenced by other textiles, and we're just kind of thinking, that at the loom, how we might then come up with something new and innovative. So that's an important part of what I feel we do at Lao Textiles. I consider, when people ask me, I say that we are a creative arts weaving studio. And as some of you have experience in Asia, you know what a challenge that is. Although as I mentioned, I had the Vietnam weavers. It's a group called CraftLink, and they work with about 6,000 artisans. And this idea, the most important points that I made to them was creative and critique, the things that you learn in art school. And they were both concepts that they appreciated, the idea that every individual can create something new and unique for themselves. And that's what I hope part of my legacy will be in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Carol. I'm curious if you could go over the life cycle of a weaver. And what I mean by this is that I've studied the history of guilds and apprenticeships throughout history. And so you have the young child at age 7 or growing up and sitting there learning weaving as far as watching from the very earliest ages. So the young child doesn't have the skill sets yet to be a weaver, so maybe doing bobbing or things like that in the early part of life. And what are those skill sets that are being developed when they're very young, and how are they helping out with that process? Then they get to be a weaver, then they get to be a master weaver. But then we've talked about dementia, and dementia sets in, or maybe injuries. Can you talk about how those factors affect how someone then stops weaving, but then they may revert back to the things that they did when they're younger, when they had the muscle memory, because we talked about cognition and muscle embodiment as far as memory. Can you talk about that as far as how they then, throughout their entire lives, they are productive and they are contributing to the family and the productive values of their community?
Yeah, well, I think I'll talk about the time period that I'm familiar with, which is the last 20, 30 years, because I don't know before that period. But a young weaver, a young woman, depending on her ethnic group, would learn these basic skills, which would be starting with a small border. And she would learn how to manipulate a warp, sitting at the kind of last stage is sitting at the loom, because she hasn't made the design, she hasn't made the warp, she hasn't spun the silk. And so she starts by that aspect and then learns gradually, maybe over the next 4 or 5 years. So by the time she's 12, she can now make a warp. She can possibly reel her own silk. She might have learned from her grandmother how to dye it with the environment around her, if it's indigo or sticklac or the kinds of natural dyes that they would have had. And then becoming a weaver in this era, I'll just talk about Bua, who's here. Her grandmother encouraged her to continue this and took her to the market. Said, you might want to weave something, and maybe someone else in the village might want to buy it. So they introduced the idea of commerce to her. And then just like we talked about with Carla, with the Mayan women's, always admiring each other's skirts, and then learning from, those weavers came from China, from Yunnan. Those Vietnamese ladies, they have something kind of interesting going on. And so it's always that flow of design and information and color that, you're integrating as you go. What we've done at Lao Textiles, because I'm 60, so I'm a sort of demented weaver, and I was thinking you could do a study on me if you want, and I'll see how it works out in the end. But we practice something, and one of the scenes you will see throughout Southeast Asia, and I'm talking now Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Burma, Myanmar, is very old women who are sitting in a village, and they're kind of hunched over from harvesting their rice or whatever it was. But they're the ones who, with their betel nut still to this day, and I work in Northeast India as well, they are the ones who are, doing a complex ECOT or showing or mastering, and they've really been the thread from the past to someone like me, where they continue, even if they're physically deformed from, the rice, there's a lot of that hunching, they're still able to practice the same, I don't want to say repetition, because the thing about weaving is it's not just you sit at a loom. You've got the agricultural part, you've got the reeling part, you've got the dyeing part, you've got the preparing your warp. So it's actually it's many repetitive patterns, if you like to see it that way. So I don't know if I answered it or not, but certainly there are, in this era, you have, learning is taking place in a very different way. And this skill is not necessarily something that people value as much as maybe I think they should. And we don't have institutions for that. I think what I'm looking at now is how government policy can affect the sustainability of artisans, rural artisans, and craftspeople. Hopefully this contributes to that.
Thank you, Kara, for amazing presentation. I have a question about transmitting knowledge among consumers in addition to the makers.
Yeah.
So I think in order to make this hand weaving and spinning sustainable, it is really important to educate buyers to discern the aesthetic, cultural, economic values embedded in the textiles. And well, to be honest, before I met you 3 years ago, I did not know anything about Laos textiles. All I knew about Southeastern textile, Southeastern silk, was Thai silk because of Tim Thompson. But now I see the difference between the two. So could you comment briefly on this? I mean, about educating consumers so that they can see the difference between fake handmade and authentic handmade and those kind of things?
Oh, thank you. It's that's a big challenge. And that's where many artisans are today, where they are investing in quality raw materials. We spoke about that. I'm working primarily with silk. I'm now working with cotton by default because some of the cotton producers in northern Laos don't have markets, or they have limited markets, and I've been experimenting with design on their behalf. And so the consumer, especially young people, it's that everything is happening so quickly. And there's this superficialness. So for example, what we've witnessed in Southeast Asia in the last, I'm going to say 3 to 5 years, mass-produced industrial textiles made with synthetics which mimic these historic textiles. And in this quickness, young people don't necessarily, not just young people, but many people don't pay attention to the provenance of how it was made and what materials were used to make it. And it becomes increasingly harder. People here are interested because we're a select and educated audience, but in the mass market, we have seen steadily the business model of money come into margins, how to minimize the quality, how to maximize a margin. And I've just, because of my work in Myanmar, I stopped at the V&A and I had a chance, I get inspiration from traveling and gardens, and I went out to Kew Garden, and they, like 2 years ago, they had a 100% cotton, 3-color dye motif on a scarf. And now they have this hive installation, but they don't have any natural material in the bee collection. It's a polycotton, one kind of sloppily done print at the same price. And I asked the buyer, why don't you have the cotton bee you had 2 years ago? She said, oh, the buyer just didn't present us with that. So I was, you see it everywhere around you. You see it in the clothes you buy, you see it in the designs, et cetera. And so you do have this kind of stratification going on where the high quality becomes unaffordable, and it's not for mass education. I think it all comes down to education. What we do at our studio is you can see every piece that you would buy being made. So that resonates with people. A lot of people walk in, they say, oh, is this all you have? This all you have? And I'm like, well, this is like a lifetime of like, you know. And they're like, oh, okay. And I'm like, would you like to see the weaving? Oh, I've seen weaving before. And I'm thinking, well, maybe you just want to have a look outside. And then they'll go outside, and 2 hours later they come in, they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. And it also applies, it's kind of, I don't mean this as sexist, but a lot of men, we have man chairs in our office. And the men come in, they're not interested. It's the women, they're going to buy a silk scarf. And then the men kind of sit down, and then they start looking around. And then their women go outside, and we show them the studio. And then they're kind of like, that's kind of interesting. And then they go outside, and they're like, I never knew that. Wow, weaving was so interesting. So you're fighting a prejudice that people have. It's women's work. It's undervalued. We don't really care about it. And because it's women's work, it ought to be cheap also. So you're fighting at a lot of different levels, what I consider ignorance, but that's the reality that we have. So, very good point.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about preservation
Yeah.
and the formats of knowledge. So I'm intrigued by this analogy that you've set up between the vertical heddle and the floppy disk, and I think that's really interesting. But that raises some questions for me around kind of the problems that we have in the digital era. So for your vertical heddles, for example, do you preserve them in duplicate? Or do you have other questions around the preservation of knowledge? In some ways, you've had to reverse engineer some of the patterns for these historic textiles. But are there other ways that you're thinking about preserving them beyond in the vertical heddles and in the fabrics themselves? And how do you save some of this more tacit knowledge of, say, the dyeing procedures or the spinning?
It's a big job. And what I mean by that is everyone does what they can. And I find I've devoted my entire life since the age of 17, sitting at a loom, working with an artisan, and there is so much to be done. There's so much in terms of the history, the narratives, the meaning of the motifs. My colleague, Mary Connors, who wrote the Oxford University book on Lao Textiles, even back in the 1980s said, we have the song, but we don't have the words. And so much of this is disappearing so quickly. It's ebbing out to sea. And when I say it's a big job, there's only so much one person can do. I'm starting to think, and people will walk in and they'll say, oh my God, what's the succession plan here? And what do you, and I'm like, there's no guarantees in life. I could, walk up the stairway the wrong way and slip and die, or whatever. What I'm realizing at the age of 60 is that I want to impart that. I want my life lessons of working with rural women in parts of the world before the digital age, working with what we do right now, which is this complex weaving, that there are so many components, everyone has a place. There is no competition. Everything everyone does is more than zero, because I think kind of 0 and 1, and ground zero is where we start, and that whether it's history students, interns, museum people, there's just a place for all of this. And weaving has really not been given the credibility and the value. The reason I'm so excited, this is in its early stages, so I'm a little bit stepping out of dangerous territory, but the Aung San Suu Kyi Foundation has hired me to implement a national strategy in Burma. And why is that so interesting to me? Because we have support at the top. And we have, of course, we have the artists, the interests, and I believe weaving is a vehicle for peace. And everywhere I work, whether it's, Bedouin or Southern Africa, apartheid. I have worked in conflict zones. I work in Cambodia. I run a charity there with landmine survivors from Pol Pot. Weaving has a healing effect. And I think that how to turn that into the viability, what we've done at Lao Textiles is we've made it viable. So people have had incomes, they've been able to buy houses, they've been able to educate their children, have better health. So what I'd like to see is that we can, maybe the end of this conference, and I think one of the things Pamela's thinking and Claire and the others is, how do you see your role in this? And, you know, there's those of us who are, I would call myself so I speak weaving, which is a global women's language, and I refer to it that way because I can go to any culture in the world and I fit right in if it's primarily women weaving, and find ways that we can harness all this interest from the digital side, all those great questions, Malcolm, I think, at our, right, you know, how, you know, I need to refer to it in terms of digital so that someone like Malcolm gets it. And then he's like, now I get it. And so I present terminology to him that's familiar. And then it's not threatening either. And so I kind of think of myself as a textile warrior and working all over. And thank you for, you know, being interested in what we do in the field, because we don't always, this is a very rare opportunity for us to integrate with neuroscience, people like Dorothy, all the experts here who have ideas about things and who it's just like how we're looking for similarities, we're looking for differences, and then how we might be able to find some platform to really make a difference.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to do this, but I'm going to push you a little bit on something that I'm going to be the really bad person. Andrew started off in the first question by asking you about where does creativity or innovation or improvisation come in. And your answer was that you are trying to bring creativity into the process. But you've talked many times before about the way in which a weaver with a vertical heddle can, you know, and deep knowledge can innovate as she goes, you know, which is the point I made in my introduction, that you can't do that with a jacquard loom, with punch cards, because it's already in the pattern.
Right.
So I just want to ask you exactly what you meant by that, because I see, you know, from some of the questions that have been asked, from some of the comments, that this pervasiveness of the hierarchy between mind and hand is present just in the way that people think about the difference between innovative creative art and rote hand skills. For example, you know, I don't think that when someone becomes very skilled that then they, you know, there was a question, are they still creative? And that there's such a division, at least there's a view that there's such a division between rote work and creativity. Or, I mean, skilled work that becomes rote and creative, artistic sensibilities.
Right. Well, just to bring it back to our loom, this long-eyed vertical heddle, that is a program that is already predetermined by the programmer. I can sit at the loom and recall 10 rows of design, which are pre-programmed, but then I can say, well, I think I'm going to add some other technique in here, or I'm going to do some supplementary here. And so I'm the human being deciding what I see going on. And I see the patterns emerging, but now I'm going to interrupt it, and I'm going to do something else to it. And I think that's the asset that hand weaver, a creative weaver, that we have over the standardization and mechanization of the jacquard. So how you want to define that creative intervention?
I'm just saying that it also is present in weavers, I mean, historically. And
oh, yes.
Traditionally.
Oh.
I was afraid that might have gotten...
Oh, okay, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for this. I'm a public policy student here at Columbia, so my questions are related to that. You talked a little bit about not being able to afford because of the high quality of the product. Do you having served in this industry for such a long time, do you think there's any scope of achieving economies of scale in this entire process where you can actually build a larger consumer base than just serving one range of consumers, because the quality of the product cannot be compromised and you still cannot serve that consumer base who are still not being able to afford the product? For example, in developing countries like Southeast Asia, where most of the population is middle income population. And do you see any scope of economies of scale in this whole industry? And if you see that there's a scope, who do you think is that stakeholder that can play an important role in bringing out this intervention, other than the government? Because government is obviously an important stakeholder, but other than the government, who do you think can actually help achieve this?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you. The economy of scale in Laos, for example, I am not the only person that is weaving. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of Lao weavers. The question then becomes is how can you remain relevant in a modern world? And I think that is a challenge. What I'm hoping to achieve in a country like Myanmar that has a kind of neglected tradition is to create value for it. That it is, women, after the new government has come into power, women are now wearing their more traditional laundries. So they're creating a market, a local market for their kind of weaving that would then allow many more people to be engaged. It is a challenge, and we have the example in Thailand where, fewer and fewer weavers, you have pockets, and they do remarkable work, but it's fewer and fewer and harder. And many of those artisan groups, especially in the Northeast, are finding it harder to find a sustainable market. And that's because of this sort of overshadow, new fabrics being produced, mimicking traditional fabrics. So I believe that hand weaving can be a vital part of the economy. I believe that those skills can be integrated into a new economic model where women, for example, are allowed to work at home. They don't have to go to an urban area. They can, preserve their identity, which I talked about, peace. All of these issues can be integrated into models of traditional practices. Yeah. There was a second part to that question, which was... the stakeholders. I think probably this idea of sort of, on the ground. We haven't seen the results. And I'm going to go out on a limb, but this idea of maybe a social enterprise that's actually innovated by a maker and not by an outsider, not by someone who had an idea. But I worked on eradication of poverty in Africa in the early 1980s on the first development programs. And I wonder, how is it 40 years later, there's still poorer women in Africa? Whatever we've been doing doesn't work. So maybe we should look at models that might work.
Thank you so much for telling us about this wonderful legacy that you've created. I wanted to tie together the last two questions a little bit and ask you a related question, which is, someone said that there's this hierarchy between design and skill that's false, and and I wonder whether that creates actually an economic hierarchy. So of course you talked about the low margins in this business overall, which make it difficult to sell to a broader audience, and you have to educate the customer. The low margins are really at the maker stage, right? Because people would go to Cambodia or Laos or Bangladesh where the wages are $30 a month, $60 a month, and ask for products to be made at $2 for an article of clothing and so on. But those things are sold at much, much higher rates here, right?
Yeah.
So could you maybe talk a little bit about, how to make that skill part valuable? For example, to some extent, the creativity along the way that you mentioned, it could be seen as a bug or a feature, right? and so the question is, how can you make it a feature so that we're paying the maker and not Louis Vuitton or Hermes and so on?
I have some good ideas about that I'm not able to implement because I don't have a technical background, but I work in extremely remote areas of the world: Northeast India, Meghalaya, Manipur, Nagaland, rural Cambodia, Preah Vihear, which didn't even have a road till a few years ago. I think that if you can figure out, and I think this would be a project for young, smart people here, if they could sell on the web or in a way that and I've looked at it from like the shipping part. You can take it to the local post office. You get local stamps. It takes 10 days to get to where it's going. What really has been a hindrance to this has been the banking system. And for example, you can't use PayPal, you can't have bank accounts in Cambodia because we're laundering money, you can't have bank accounts in these. So for example, I run this charity in Cambodia. We make remarkable, beautiful products. The goal is to have the artisans have as much of that margin, sell it for $45, sell it here at the Guggenheim for $90. That's reasonable, 100% markup. But the way to get it to them is really the constraint. And so if some of these, young tech entrepreneurial types who are like, I work pro bono on all these projects, if you can see that these artisans need your skill, and it would be about setting up platforms that they could access the market. You are happy in New York that you can buy a scarf made in Bangladesh we can do custom order. You could have your color, your design, whatever, and then the artisan would play a vital role in the supply chain where you're cutting out a lot of the intermediaries who are then, they do valid work because they have to go there and get it, they have to import it, they have to pay duty, they have to have a retail store maybe, so there are real costs involved in that. But I do think there is a place that's emerging that would actually bring the artisan together with the final consumer. And I haven't figured that out in the banking systems in the countries that I work with.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like everybody to join me again in thanking Carol for a wonderful presentation.